China is now our peer scientifically. It is the most important other country to be working with on science, whether you're government or academia or whatever. And what we're doing right now in terms of cutting science funding in the United States is cutting off our nose to spite our face.
Welcome. My name is Abigail Coplin, and I'm an assistant professor of sociology and science, technology, and society at Vassar College. I'm also a member of the 7th cohort of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations Public Intellectual Program. On behalf of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, I'm here today to lead a conversation about the recent extension and amendment of the U.S. China Science and Technology Cooperation Agreement, or STA, a topic about which I know today's panelists and myself are deeply passionate. I'm ecstatic to be joined by three distinguished speakers today. Dr. Scott Kennedy, Senior Advisor and Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Deborah Seligsohn, Associate Professor of Political Science at Villanova University. And Dr. Denis Simon, Non-Resident Fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and Visiting Professor at Duke University's Asian Pacific Studies Institute. Many thanks to all three of you for finding time in the middle of the summer to come and join us today. I think it makes sense to start our conversation today with a bit of history about the Science and Technology Agreement between the US and China. As someone who's been intimately involved in the STA's administration, Deb, could you tell us a bit about what the STA is? What kind of scientific collaborations does it govern? And what kind of collaborations lie outside of its purview?
So the STA was the first treaty signed between the US and China following normalization of relations in 1979. So it holds a very important historic place, especially for the Chinese who take that very seriously. It covers all government-to-government science relations explicitly, and there have been over 100 protocols and annexes under the agreement with specific cooperation. It also originally said that it covered any cooperation, laboratories, universities, etc. Although, at least in terms of US law, that really had no power, but it did have sort of important moral power when dealing with China. And so that's the basic history of the agreement.
Could you give us some examples of some projects that have historically taken place under the agreement, perhaps?
Yeah, so one of the most famous is what's known as the birth defects study that showed that supplementing women's diet with folic acid would massively reduce two important birth defects, spina bifida and hydrocephalus. The CDC names that as one of its 10 greatest achievements of the 20th century. Another has been our HIV/AIDS cooperation work, which really helped China stop a major AIDS epidemic in its track. They really have done very well. Others include incredible work on climate change, including over 150 patents done under the agreement. And we actually came up with new intellectual property agreements to make that work for US companies and Chinese companies. But it also includes like pure science, like physics, paleontology, a lot of dinosaurs found in China. It's a huge range, but what it doesn't cover is direct commercial applications generally. It's mostly about science between the two governments.
Got it. And Scott, could you tell us a bit historically about what the renewal process has generally looked like? Likewise, when and why did the SCA renewal start to be a little bit more contentious?
Sure. Well, Abby, thanks for having us on the program. And it's great to be here with Deb and Dennis to discuss this important agreement and the broader issues that it touches upon. Um, I think that the STA goes back to 1979. Is meant to be renewed every 5 years. And I think for most of the period, it was, occasionally it would take time to, for the two governments to talk to each other and renew it. I think the first time there was a real challenge was in 2017 and 18 during the first Trump administration. U.S. China relations already had become a little rockier a little greater attention to the national security challenges that the two sides face, growing worries about misdirection of science for non-cooperative purposes. But during that time in 2017-18, the focus was on intellectual property. And so the two sides took, I think, a year or more, Deb knows probably the specifics, to negotiate a new annex on intellectual property protection, which was then embedded in the agreement. When it came up for renewal 5 years later, a whole series of issues came up. And of course, the relationship had continued to devolve, at least at the official level. I mean, you had greater concerns about the intersection of tech and national security. Then you have the pandemic, and you have just a general shift in the United States anxieties about China. And I think a lot of people thought, well, it's possible that this agreement won't be extended. And I remember meeting with Deb and officials from the U.S. government in 2021 and 2022, and we were thinking, well, actually, maybe it may just be tossed aside. But to the Biden administration's credit, although they kept quiet, they did negotiate an extension. And on three particular areas, they reached adjustments with the latest agreement. The first is, as Deb already implied, narrowing the scope. So the original agreement essentially applied to all kinds of scholarly engagement, hard sciences, soft sciences, humanities, and whether or not it was government funded. Although government funded hard sciences were at the core, the way it was crafted but based on talking to people who were there at the creation, it basically applied more broadly and provided a general umbrella for everyone. And so they narrowed the scope quite a bit to explicitly only cover government-funded hard sciences. The second area, which is where they made changes, was to really focus on researcher safety. There have been a few cases of people traveling to China and facing a variety of challenges, investigations, detentions, what have you. And the U.S. government wanted to make sure that that kind of misdeed would not come up in the context of science and technology cooperation. So they had written into the agreement explicit requirements for ensuring the safety, well-being, and fair treatment of scientists engaged in science and technology cooperation between the two countries. The last element that was edited into the new agreement is about data transparency and reciprocity. People who've done research in China have sometimes had difficulty taking their data with them. And so they wanted to make sure that whatever data restrictions were imposed on Americans doing work in China, that there'd be the same in the other direction, with the goal of making it so that both sides had reduced restrictions, so that there'd be much greater data transparency for everybody, because you need that. That's a basic requirement when you're doing scholarly work that's peer-reviewed, published, to have that kind of data transparency. So those were the three things, and the two sides reached agreement and issued the agreement in December of 2024, although we didn't see a text until April. And I think this was partly by strategy, those that want to support science and technology cooperation, recognizing that there's no full-scale consensus on this, tried to be careful and quiet about it. And so the agreement was issued in April, and it's the one that we are now operating under.
Great. Thank you so much. Denis, I know that you've done a lot of research comparing China's science and technology agreements with countries around the world. How does the agreement with the U.S. compare to some of the other science and technology agreements China has with other countries? And do you see the current agreement as serving both American and Chinese interests?
Great question. Thank you for having me. And this is really an important topic. China today now has actually over 100, well over 100 agreements with other countries for cooperation in science and technology. It has now stationed more than 40 professionals overseas in their embassies, science counselors, science attachés, etc. So China has gone in a big way for scientific diplomacy. And let me give you two examples where I think we can understand China's strategy. The first one is with the European Union. I think that even though China has individual bilateral agreements with countries like Germany or France or Italy, etc., it also engages in a very broad-based relationship with the European Union. And a lot of these are covered under the so-called framework programs that the European Union has. So a few years ago, they made a decision that their programs would be very sector-specific, they'd be highly structured, and they'd be heavily embedded in what I would call their multilateral or this programmatic framework. And so compared to the United States, their programs are much more multi-layered. Frankly, they're less politicized, or at least up until the present have been. They're more institutionalized in terms of joint centers. And I think that generally speaking, they're much less adversarial. And even though there are some issues like data security on the table these days, they're much more the product of moderate caution, with the goal being let's have engagement. And so the Chinese have participated in a number of things starting since 1998 with the Europeans, and most of them have yielded very, very good results. They've been involved in Horizon 2020, which ran from 2014 to 2020, and they're now involved in Horizon Europe, which runs from 2021 to 2027. All of these things, unlike the US one, however, all have some link usually to some kind of commercial result. They don't exist in just the world of science, but they're supposed to yield multifaceted results, both to the scientific community as well as to the business community. But the other one I think that's really important, and this is very recent and the product of a kind of rethink, is the Chinese engagement with the BRI countries. In June of this year in Chengdu, there was a major meeting in which China laid out a whole brand new strategic thrust towards the BRI countries that's very different than the so-called debt diplomacy or resource diplomacy that they had been practicing. And they initiated a program called Building an Innovation Silk Road for Shared Development, Together for Innovation, Development for All. And unlike some of the rhetoric that had been associated with the previous BRI initiatives, this one actually showed some very, very concrete actions that were going to be taken, and a number of big things that came out of it, including one called the International Meridian Circle for Big Science, and then also two other special cooperative programs, one on AI, science and technology for innovation, and another on traditional Chinese medicine. So all in all, what this begins to suggest is that China, is going in for a big way into science diplomacy as part of its efforts to build bridges with other countries. And we're going to see a much more prominent China on the horizon as these programs kick in. In contrast to the United States, we have only about 60 international science and technology agreements. And in fact, most recently, under the current administration, the Office of International S&T Cooperation under the State Department is said to be now being reorganized or even possibly disbanded. Now, for allied countries, we go in a big way for this kind of cooperation. But for China, there is a great deal of now strategic caution. So I agree fully with Scott. From 1979 to about 2016, 2017, we were in full bore into that China relationship. But since that time, we have now taken a step back. We've made the program more restrictive. You might want to say more focused, but it has much less heft to it than it did in the initial 25 years the program had been in place.
Thank you so much for that commentary, Denis. And that's an excellent transition to moving towards some questions about the significance of the SDA beyond the particularities of the concrete agreement. And it raises some issues that I know you've written on, Scott. In your commentary previously, you mentioned that the current agreement reflects a much more narrow scope in comparison to prior STAs, with an exclusive focus on hard rather than social sciences and exclusively government-to-government collaborations. Even with this narrower scope, do you think that the renewed STA will still have a meaningful impact on topics and projects beyond the kinds of collaborations that it specifically governs?
It could. It could. Just want to make sure everyone knows I wrote that together with Deb. So she wielded a powerful pen in this writing partnership for sure. And so, but I hope that the narrowing on paper doesn't translate to a total dismissal of the government's commitment to supporting U.S. China scholarly engagement and cooperation amongst social scientists and humanists. I say that self-interestedly because I'm not a hard scientist. You put some math in front of me and I just go to jello. So I do field work in social sciences, on economics, on other industrial policy. And I thought having that agreement was valuable for not just myself, but my discipline, for folks that do area studies, and for my Chinese counterparts. I think the other edits to the agreement regarding researcher safety and data reciprocity, I think they're really quite constructive. And I'd give both governments for credit for finding a common landing space on this. Why don't we all benefit? You know, they're not going to edit the agreement, right? This is only done once every 5 years, and who knows what'll happen when we get to 2028 and 9 and are thinking about potentially renewing it, because we got no idea where the heck this relationship is going to be at that point, given the trajectory. But we don't really need the text to say that we're covered to self-declare that we're covered. So I think universities, academic associations, area studies groups can all essentially self-declare that they are committed to the norms that are laid out in this agreement. And you can then feel more comfortable engaging in collaboration with organizations and groups on the other side that have also made that commitment. And so I don't think that we need to just simply dispense with the idea that it doesn't cover everything. I think we can figure out ways creatively, and even if it's not necessarily referenced to this agreement, the basic principles that that we need cooperation, that it can be valuable, but that we need to adhere to the highest standards of scholarship and academic freedom and safety for those that participate, with regard to how research is done, to human subjects. I think those are standards which scholars around the world, including in the U.S. and China, should be able to commit to, whether it's through this agreement or not. I think actually the other area that I'm more worried about, and maybe Denis and Deb can speak to this, is just the fact that the U.S. government is doing a lot less to support science, much less funding through NIH to universities. And probably the biggest problem to U.S. China cooperation is partly U.S. China, but it's what is the U.S. doing? What's the U.S. government doing in terms of supporting science? That's something that they know a lot more about than me. And maybe they can solve that problem, since I've solved what social scientists should do in the wake of this agreement.
Thanks so much. And I think that does make a great segue into kind of discussing the broader system of global innovation in which the STA is embedded, and thinking about China's changing role within it. I just recently got back from a trip to China where I was interviewing a number of agrobiotechnologists about their research. And even in comparison to 5 years ago, I was really struck by the confidence in and optimism about China's changing role in scientific development that these researchers espoused, both generally and in comparison to the US position. Deb, how do you see the U.S.-China relationship in science and technology right now? How has it changed in the past few decades? What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Abby. So, yeah, directly following on what Scott said, this agreement is an umbrella agreement, and activity happens under it only if we have specific agreements by departments or institutes within each government that choose to work together. And since 2016, 2017, that started to decline actually pre-COVID, and then with COVID in 2020, it really fell off a cliff. So we do have some agreements extant, but especially still in health, actually. But like all of our climate cooperation is basically gone. A lot of other cooperation that we had under this agreement is pretty dormant. And so it's good that it was renewed because it gives us the opportunity, especially if relations improve in the future, to do more government to government. But the other part of the reality is that China is now our peer scientifically. It is the most important other country to be working with on science, whether you're government or academia or whatever. And what we're doing right now in terms of cutting science funding in the United States is cutting off our nose to spite our face. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense from a national priority point of view. And the combination of that with the sort of attack on U.S. China cooperation is that we are going to see global science kind of move around the world and become much less focused. We've sort of had a hub and spoke type arrangement with science over the last 80 years at this point, where the United States is the center. And if you go back historically, there's traditionally been one scientific center where everybody else works with. It was originally France, and then it was Germany, and then after World War II, it became the United States. It's not that I think China is going to become the center of global science, because they also have lots of political restrictions that make it not as easy for international folks to work there. What I think we're more going to see is, for the next foreseeable future, there is no center. And I think that's bad for science. But the people that get hurt the most are going to be American scientists. Molly Roberts and her group at UCSD have already shown that when U.S. science U.S. China science cooperation goes down, U.S. scientists are hurt more than their Chinese counterparts in terms of the number of publications they produce. So in any cutting edge area, I think we're going to see ourselves being hurt. And there are a lot of areas where it seems to be just established views in Washington that the US is ahead, where if you go to China, that's not clear at all. And I would name AI at the top of that list. There's a lot of stuff happening. I was told, for example, everybody knows about the DeepSeek moment, right? That suddenly we discovered China had, this fantastic AI tool. I was told by somebody in the field in China that, oh, actually, there are 100 that are just like DeepSeek. It's not one. And so we need to know better what's going on. And one of the big things about U.S. China government to government cooperation has been it gives us a window into what's happening. And, having spent about 8 months in China during and since COVID, what I can tell you is most people in the United States just don't understand how much progress has happened in the 5 years since COVID because they've had no contact.
Yeah. And thus now is absolutely not the time to be pushing for decoupling. Denis, what is your perspective on cross-border collaboration? The dominant narrative in both Beijing and DC right now, I've been really struck by, in that it conceives Chinese science and American science as really discrete entities. Does this reflect the reality of how cutting-edge science works these days?
Well, we're at a very, very different point than we were 10 years ago. And the key to this, I think, are some of the restrictions that are being put in place about the cross-border flow of talent. human resources. And even to quote Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping says, the key to innovation is having the right talent in place. And that obviously not only applies to China, it applies to all countries. Um, and I was part of a National Academy of Sciences report on the global talent pool about 2 years ago, in which they produced a result that highlighted the strategic importance of our pipeline globally, and particularly with China, to the long-term scientific productivity of the United States. And that report never really saw much daylight, and unfortunately, it was lost in the shuffle of all the other issues that are on the U.S. Agenda these days. But I think there's an interesting thing happening. If you read the South China Morning Post, it now regularly reports on another Chinese scientist who has decided to leave the United States and go back to China with a new lab, with sufficient research money. And this all speaks to the point that both Deb and Scott made about the funding of science. Recently, one of the most famous mathematicians here in the United States has decided to go back to, I think it's Chongqing University, to restart their research career because they were hurting. And so I think that whatever you look at, there are clouds in the sky. The recent budgetary bill that is now underway in Congress, it includes provisions perhaps for a return of a second iteration of the China Initiative. And as we know, during the first iteration of it, it was a horrible experience and ruined the careers of many Chinese scientists. And in almost every case, there was not enough evidence or any evidence to even prosecute them to the full extent that they were accused of engaging in all these illicit activities. But I think that what we've seen is probably now close to almost 2,000 Chinese scientists, ethnic Chinese scientists, and postdocs. And here's where I think it's very important to understand. Postdocs make up really the crux of what drives the research enterprise in the United States. If we are going to lose a large number of postdoc people from China who are either not going to come or either going to go back early, that's going to also do irreparable damage to our scientific enterprise. So I think that we've got to be very careful here, that we're not only cutting the funding for the research, but also that people themselves, the ones who are engaged in the collaboration, are now not looking very positively about the current situation. I know I was in China for 4 months this early this year, and I was located at Tsinghua. I spoke to a lot of scientists. Most of them have a great deal of trepidation about even beginning new initiatives with American counterparts. And the American counterparts have been told by their academic leadership, don't get too chummy with China, because that's not going to be good for our university. We could lose federal funds, etc. And when I asked them what law are they talking about, no one can point to any law. It's like a hidden blacklist that they're going to be put under if they engage in too much activity with China. So there are clouds, on the horizon that don't seem to be very promising to go away. And this all runs counter to where global innovation is. Global innovation today is made up of cross-border, cross-cultural, interdisciplinary teams, and new scientific discoveries are embedded in all sorts of places around the world. And if we become much more the Lone Ranger in some ways, we're going to do great hurt to our own ability to be a scientific leader in the world, let alone the leader. To be a leader is what concerns me.
Thanks. No, your comments really resonate deeply with conversations that I was having myself. When you talk to researchers in China right now and ask them, for example, what's really driving the surge in biological sciences, their answer is basically two things. One, as all of you have alluded, money. But the other one is really the human capital story, that China has been able to leverage these talent flows to its advantage. And the people who came back in the 2010s are now training the next generation of students and really having a major impact. Likewise, I think that your comments, Denis, also act as a really great segue to trying to talk a little bit about what we think needs to change. To all of you, if you had to recommend a single change that you would like to see, either on the US side or the Chinese side to promote a more functional relationship in science and technology, what would it be?
You want me to go
I'll go.
first, or Dennis go first? Go ahead, Dennis.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I think that when we think about some kind of grand deal that our President Trump wants to make with President Xi Jinping, I think the word science and technology ought to be included in that great deal, or that big deal he wants to make, and that symbolically, if not substantively, if both leaders could make a statement to say they'd like to see the science and technology relationship re-energized or revitalized, even if it's focused on a much more narrow set of issues, that would do great help to making things get restarted again, and I think would put us in a good position.
Deb, if you had a message for the current administration when it comes to science and technology, what would it be?
Well, so for the US, I think fund US science is still the most important thing, which isn't really a message for China as well. I do think both countries need to deal with the increasing problems with international travel and international collaboration. That Scott mentioned the problems that some folks have had getting into China. Um, every counterpart I have in China talks about the problems they have getting into the United States as well. And most recent reporting is that actually permission to leave China is also becoming more complicated. So I think just encouraging the interaction that we know is vital to science, of people being able to meet and share and discuss, is going to be really important, and is a policy change both countries need to make.
Absolutely. And Scott, do you have a recommendation?
Sure. I think the first thing is Dennis, Deb, you, me, many of the people watching this program, we know U.S. China science and technology cooperation is important. We know the funding of science is important. We're all speaking to the choir, but we don't do enough to explain that to the rest of the American public and the global public, that a lot of average Americans see this as an elite enterprise that bears no benefit, that they don't benefit from. And I think we have to explain in very tangible ways why this makes their lives better, why it makes their children's lives better. And if not for this, how things would be worse. And I think that taking this for granted as a good makes you highly vulnerable to get totally canceled in budgets and in the national and global conversation. So I think the first thing is we have to do a much better job of explaining why this is important. I think the second thing is to recognize and manage what are real trade-offs. There are some risks, whether it's about researcher safety or about national security or about commercial competition and IP theft. We have to recognize those, but then instead of saying, well, let's not do these things because of the risks, we've got practical ways to manage those risks, to make it so that we can mitigate those. While there may be a small number of things that you cannot do, there's going to be export controls on things which should not feed into the Chinese military or in other ways that might harm the US. But if you can mitigate those risks sufficiently in a practical way, then and you've justified why you need to do this in the first place, then I think that creates much greater policy space in which to operate, and then allows scientists and scholars to do what they do best.
That is an excellent point to close a publicly oriented program on. Thank you all very much for today's timely discussion about the amended STA and for sharing your insights on the future of U.S. China collaboration in the sciences. I would also like to thank the National Committee staff who behind the scenes helped make this interview possible. If you enjoyed it, we hope that you will join us for future National Committee programs. Thanks so much.